How empires rose and fell, the Cold War's ancient blueprint explained in 20 minutes. Stay with me, because at the end of this video, you will understand why every empire, from ancient Rome to the Soviet Union itself, collapses for almost exactly the same reason. And that reason has nothing to do with military strength or economic power alone. It is something far more subtle, far more inevitable, and far more relevant to what we are living through right now than most people realize. If you've lived through any part of the Cold War, subscribe to this channel right now, because every video we make is built for you, someone who was there, who remembers the tension, and who now wants to finally understand what it all meant. And here's what I want to know. Leave a comment below telling us which decade of the Cold War shaped your life the most. The 1950s? The Missile Crisis? Vietnam? The 80s? Your story matters to the conversation we are building here. Wait, this is the part where I need your absolute full attention for a moment. What you are about to hear is not the standard Cold War narrative you learned in school. It is the pattern underneath it all, the mechanism that explains not just why the Soviets fell in 1989, but why every great power eventually does. In the description below and in our pinned comment, you will find our complete ebook guide on the deeper patterns of Cold War strategy, where we break down the specific declassified signals, the intelligence reports, and the command decisions that prove this cycle exists. This is not free, because it contains the real intelligence framework that historians and strategists use to understand power transitions. But if you want to go much deeper than this video allows, that guide is where the real answers live. Here is the secret that most history channels miss entirely. When we talk about empires falling, whether we are discussing Rome in 410 AD or the Soviet Union in 1991, we almost always focus on the dramatic moment, the conquest, the collapse, the final day. But every single one of those empires did not fall because they suddenly became weak. They fell because they succeeded too well, too far from home, for too long. The Roman Empire, at its height under Trajan around 117 AD, stretched across more than 2 million square miles. You could stand at the edge of Roman Britain and send a message to a garrison commander in Syria, and that message would take weeks to arrive. The empire had conquered so much land, so thoroughly, that it had to maintain a standing military presence on virtually every border, in every province, guarding against threats that sometimes did not even exist, or existed only because Rome's presence created them. Now skip forward to the 1950s and 1960s. The United States, fresh from victory in World War II, faced a similar prospect. America did not conquer land the way Rome did. Instead, America made a choice that is far more important to understand. It decided to defend ideological boundaries. It committed to containing communism everywhere on Earth, not just within America's borders, not even just in Europe, but in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, in the Pacific. Think about what that means logistically. Think about what it costs. Rome had to garrison soldiers in Britannia, in Nubia, in Parthia. The United States, in its moment of post-war dominance, had to maintain military bases in Japan, South Korea, West Germany, the Philippines, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and dozens of other nations. Each base required supplies. Each supply line had to be defended, each commitment had to be reinforced, and each reinforcement came with an expectation that America would maintain that presence forever. The Roman Empire could not sustain its borders, neither could the Soviet Union sustain its. And here is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The Soviet Union faced the exact same problem, but in reverse. It had committed to defending an ideological sphere that stretched from East Germany to Vietnam, from Cuba to Afghanistan. The Kremlin, like Rome's emperors centuries before, believed that allowing any single outpost to fall would trigger a cascade of losses. So they reinforced, they doubled down, they sent tanks into Hungary in 1956, they invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, they poured resources into Vietnam through proxies, they finally invaded Afghanistan in 1979. But here is the part that textbooks almost never emphasize clearly. Every single one of those commitments meant withdrawing resources from somewhere else. Every reinforcement in Eastern Europe meant less investment in Soviet agriculture, in consumer goods, in infrastructure. Every intervention in distant theaters meant fewer rubles for schools, for hospitals, for modernizing aging industries. The Romans faced this identical arithmetic. As Rome expanded, it needed more soldiers. More soldiers required more food. Food had to be grown in provinces and shipped to military zones. That meant less food for civilian populations. It meant infrastructure falling into disrepair because engineers were conscripted for military projects. It meant the very system holding the empire together, roads, supply chains, administrative networks, gradually becoming inefficient. This is what empires do not understand until it is far too late. Expansion is not a problem when you are growing. Growth can hide inefficiency. Growth can mask decay. But at a certain point, the costs of maintaining the expanded territory begin to exceed the benefits of controlling it. And that is when the real collapse begins. Not with an invasion, not with a sudden military defeat, but with a slow, grinding, inevitable exhaustion of resources. The American government understood this problem better than most, which is why the strategy was different. America did not try to occupy Soviet territory. America did not plant flags everywhere. Instead, America made a more subtle calculation. Spend enough on defense and military presence to contain the Soviets, but not so much that it bankrupts the nation. This balance was fragile. It was debated endlessly in the Oval Office, in the Pentagon, in Congress. But it is the reason why America, unlike Rome or the Soviet Union, managed to maintain its dominance without collapsing under its own weight. The Soviets, meanwhile, never mastered this balance. They kept pushing, they kept committing, they kept reinforcing until the moment they simply could not anymore. And that brings us to the most crucial insight of all, the one that connects ancient Rome, the Cold War era, and every empire before and since. Empires do not die because of external enemies. That is the lie that every failing empire tells itself. Rome blamed the barbarians. The Soviet Union blamed Western imperialism and internal saboteurs. Empires die because they make a logical error about geography and commitment. They assume that the territory they have conquered will remain conquered, that the alliances they have forged will remain intact, that the military expenditure required to maintain their presence will somehow decrease over time. It never decreases, it only grows. Every generation must face the same costs the previous generation faced, and then some. Every new threat in any corner of the empire requires a response, and every response strains the system further. This is where we must pause and understand something crucial about the pattern. It does not matter whether you are ruling through direct conquest or through ideological alliance. The mathematics of overextension remain the same. Rome learned this too late. The Soviet Union learned it too late. But the American strategists who studied Roman history, who read declassified intelligence reports, and who ran the numbers on American global commitments, some of them saw it coming. The question that haunted American strategists throughout the 1970s and early 1980s was simple. Can America afford to keep doing this? Can we maintain military presence on every continent, support every ally, deter every potential threat, and still keep our own economy functioning? The Soviets never asked that question seriously until it was too late. And that is the final piece of the pattern that explains why empires rise and fall. In Moscow, meanwhile, the men in power were asking a completely different question. They were not wondering whether they could afford their commitments. They had already decided they could not. The Soviet economy was a machine running on borrowed time. Military spending consumed between 12 and 17% of Soviet gross domestic product, an enormous drain for a nation whose total economic output was less than half that of the United States. The mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. Moscow could build missiles and tanks and submarines. Moscow could project power across Eastern Europe, into Afghanistan, into Cuba, into Africa. But Moscow could not do both and also feed its own people adequately, clothe them, house them, or give them consumer goods that made life worth living. The American strategists at Rand understood this with crystalline clarity because they read Soviet newspapers, they intercepted Soviet communications, and they studied Soviet economic statistics. What they saw was a superpower that had chosen guns over butter and was running out of both. This realization became the foundation of American Cold War strategy in the final decade. Outlast them. Do not negotiate surrender. Do not pull back. Do not assume Soviet strength. Instead, maintain pressure, sustain commitment, and wait for the internal contradictions of the Soviet system to tear it apart from within. Ronald Reagan, who took office in January 1981, understood this strategy intellectually and embraced it viscerally. He believed the Soviet Union was not merely a rival superpower, it was an evil empire, a system fundamentally corrupted and destined for collapse. This was not a diplomatic assessment, this was a moral judgment. And from that judgment flowed a foreign policy that was, in its own way, as uncompromising as anything Stalin had attempted. Reagan's military buildup was not subtle. Over his first term, defense spending increased from approximately $130 billion to over $270 billion. That was an increase of more than 100% in real terms, adjusted for inflation. The Strategic Defense Initiative, dismissed by critics as Star Wars, committed American resources to a space-based anti-missile system that might or might not work, but which served a deeper purpose. It signaled to the Soviets that the United States intended to compete in every domain, at every level, without regard to cost or plausibility. The message was clear: we will spend whatever it takes to stay ahead of you. And the Soviets felt it. In the Kremlin, in the Defense Ministry, in the industrial plants that built weapons, the realization began to crystallize that they could not keep pace. This was not a new fear. Soviet leadership had worried about American economic dominance since the 1960s, but in the early 1980s, that worry became panic. The aging Soviet leadership, men in their 70s and 80s, products of Stalin's era, could see that their system was failing and that no amount of military spending could fix it. Before we continue deeper into the final act of the Cold War, I need you to understand something crucial: the specific mechanisms and signals that historians now recognize as leading directly to the Soviet collapse have been documented in extraordinary detail. Our complete guide, the ebook we've created and left in the description, along with the pinned comment, walks you through the economic data, the declassified intelligence assessments, and the policy decisions that made the end inevitable. This is where you move beyond the headline version of history and understand the underlying architecture. The guide is the resource that transforms you from a viewer into someone who truly comprehends why empires fall. Between 1981 and 1985, several shifts happened simultaneously, and if you understand how they overlapped, you understand how the Cold War actually ended. First, oil prices collapsed. The Soviet Union, like Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, was an oil-dependent economy. When crude prices fell from over $100 per barrel to under $30, the foreign currency that Moscow desperately needed simply disappeared. Second, interest rates in America stayed brutally high. Paul Volcker, the Federal Reserve chairman, had driven inflation out of the American economy by keeping interest rates above 15% through much of 1980 and 1981. This choked off Soviet access to Western credit. And third, the American technology embargo, the restriction on selling advanced semiconductors, computers, and machinery to the Soviet Union, began to bite deeper as the digital revolution accelerated. The Soviets could build weapons, but they could not afford to run them. Tank engines were aging. Submarines were becoming unreliable. The Soviet Air Force was flying aircraft that were technically obsolete compared to American fighters, and the Kremlin knew this. Soviet intelligence reports from this era, now declassified, show that Moscow's own strategists understood they were losing the arms race. They could not match American military spending. They could not match American technology. They could not sustain their empire. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. He was younger than his predecessors, only 54 years old. He had traveled in Western Europe and understood that the Soviet standard of living was falling catastrophically behind. His first instinct was not to surrender. His first instinct was to reform. He believed the Soviet system could be fixed, could be modernized, could be made competitive again. He introduced glasnost, which meant openness, allowing Soviet citizens to speak more freely about problems. He introduced perestroika, which meant restructuring, attempting to reform the Soviet economy while keeping the Communist Party in power. These reforms, well-intentioned as they were, turned out to be poison. By allowing Soviet citizens to speak openly about problems, Gorbachev unleashed 70 years of accumulated grievances. Citizens began asking, why do we have shortages when the state controls everything? Why is the party elite living in luxury while ordinary people stand in breadlines? Why have we spent trillions on weapons when our hospitals are falling apart? The answer was always the same: because the system is broken, and once that realization spread, it could not be contained. In Eastern Europe, the meaning was even clearer. Poland, which had never accepted Soviet domination quietly, erupted first. The Solidarity movement, led by Lech Wałęsa, a shipyard electrician, mobilized millions of Poles around a simple demand: freedom. Hungary opened its border with Austria in the autumn of 1989, and suddenly East Germans realized they could walk into the West. The Berlin Wall, which had stood for 28 years as the ultimate symbol of Soviet power, began to crack. And on November 9, 1989, as crowds gathered at the wall with hammers and chisels, it became clear to everyone watching that the Cold War was ending not with a bang, but with a collapse. The Soviet Union itself would last only 2 more years. The reforms that Gorbachev had initiated to save the system accelerated its destruction instead. By December 1991, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved. 15 independent republics emerged from its ruins. Russia, suddenly stripped of its empire and its superpower status, began a chaotic transition toward something. No one knew exactly what. And the United States, which had prepared for 46 years to fight the Soviet Union, suddenly had to figure out who it was without that enemy. This is the part where the ancient pattern becomes visible. For nearly half a century, the United States and the Soviet Union had organized their entire existence around the assumption that they would eventually fight each other. Every dollar spent, every base established, every alliance formed, every strategic decision made, all of it was predicated on the belief that this confrontation was inevitable. Then, in the space of a few years, that entire framework dissolved. The Soviet system, weighed down by the burden of competing with American power across every continent and every domain, simply ran out of resources. It was not defeated in a war. It was not conquered militarily. It collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning. Empires do not fall because they are defeated by stronger forces. Empires fall because they attempt to sustain commitments that their resources cannot support. Rome extended itself across too many provinces and could not defend them all. The Soviet Union extended itself across too many continents and could not afford them all. The pattern is ancient, and it is inexorable. A superpower can remain supreme only as long as it can afford supremacy. The moment the cost exceeds the capacity to pay, the countdown to collapse has begun. The Americans understood this in the 1980s, even if they did not fully articulate it. The strategy was not to defeat the Soviet Union militarily. The strategy was to outspend it, outcompete it, and outlast it until the internal contradictions became unbearable. And it worked. Not because America was morally superior, though many Americans believed that. Not because capitalism was inherently better than communism, though the market had proven more flexible and more productive, but because the United States, despite its own problems and contradictions, had resources and resilience that the Soviet system simply lacked. What comes next is not a victory lap. What comes next is the far more complicated story of what happens to a superpower that has won a contest it never expected to win so completely. But that is a story for another time. For now, understand this. The Cold War did not end because of a treaty or a declaration. It ended because one of the two protagonists ran out of money and hope at the same moment. And that is the oldest pattern in the history of empires. A pattern that stretches all the way back to those first civilizations building cities between two rivers, trying to hold on to power that eventually, inevitably, slipped from their grasp. Because what actually happened between 1945 and 1989 was not inevitable. It only looks that way in hindsight. The Soviet Union did not collapse because capitalism was intrinsically stronger or because Western democracy was morally superior. Those were the stories both sides told themselves. The truth, the secret I promised you at the beginning of this film, is far more specific and far more consequential. The Cold War ended because one system was built on a lie about its own sustainability, and the other was built on the assumption that it could afford to wait. And when those two assumptions finally collided with reality, the outcome was never in doubt. The Soviet system had always operated on a fundamental paradox. It promised equality while concentrating absolute power. It claimed to represent the workers while extracting everything from them. It projected strength while rotting from within. For decades this worked because the apparatus of surveillance and coercion was complete and total. People learned not to ask questions. They learned not to hope for better. But by the 1980s, something had shifted. Information was seeping in. Young Soviets were hearing Western music, reading samizdat literature, catching glimpses of a world that lived differently, and more importantly, they were starting to see that the empire their parents had built was failing them in the most basic ways, not providing food, not providing opportunity, not providing a future that made sense. The American system, by contrast, had always been built on something the Soviet planners could never quite understand: abundance. Not for everyone equally, that was never the promise, but enough abundance that most people, most of the time, could believe in some version of the American dream. That abundance allowed the United States to spend without limit on weapons, on space exploration, on military bases spread across the globe. The Soviet Union tried to match every dollar, every missile, every gesture of power, but they were matching an infinite game with finite resources. Reagan's military buildup was not primarily about achieving military superiority. By most technical measures, the two superpowers were already at rough parity. It was about something subtler and more devastating. It was about forcing the Soviets to keep spending until they could no longer afford to. And it worked not because American generals were smarter, but because the American system could absorb the cost in a way that the Soviet system could not. By 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet economy was in freefall. Military spending was consuming nearly 18% of GDP. Inflation was spiraling. Oil prices had crashed, removing a crucial source of hard currency. And most critically, Mikhail Gorbachev had opened a door that could not be closed. His policies of glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring, had been intended to save the Soviet system by making it more transparent, more efficient, more responsive. Instead, they had unleashed forces that the Communist Party could no longer control. Once people were allowed to speak, they spoke. Once they could read uncensored information, they read. Once they could imagine alternatives, the present became intolerable. The wall fell not because Western tanks pushed it over. It fell because the threat behind it, the willingness to shoot anyone who tried to leave, had finally evaporated. And the threat evaporated because the system that had sustained it was no longer willing or able to enforce it. On November 9, 1989, a confused East German official announced that travel restrictions were being lifted. He was not authorized to say this. He simply misspoke under pressure, and the crowd heard what they needed to hear. Within hours, people were flooding through the checkpoints. The border guards did nothing. There was no massacre, no tanks rolling in to restore order. There was simply silence, and in that silence, an empire died. This was not the end of the Cold War as a declaration. This was the end of the Cold War as a collapse. The Soviet Union did not surrender. It simply imploded. Within 2 years, the USSR itself would cease to exist, fractured into 15 separate republics, its nuclear arsenal scattered across a landscape that no one controlled. The great ideological contest that had defined the second half of the 20th century was over. And here is the insight that connects it all the way back to Sumer, to Rome, to every empire that has ever risen and fallen. Empires do not typically end in defeat. They end in exhaustion. They end when the cost of maintaining power exceeds the will to pay it. They end when the people being held together by force finally lose faith in the system's promise. The Roman Empire did not fall because the barbarians were more powerful than the legions. It fell because Rome could no longer afford to garrison every frontier, maintain every road, field every army. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse because the British were superior warriors. It fragmented because the cost of holding together an empire spanning 3 continents exceeded the Sultanate's capacity to generate revenue and loyalty. The Spanish Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the British Empire, all of them followed the same pattern. They expanded until expansion became unsustainable. They maintained their power through military and bureaucratic force until the moment when the population being controlled decided that the cost of compliance, in money, in dignity, in future possibilities, was too high. And then, often suddenly, they dissolved. What made the Cold War different was that it was the first great power conflict where the victory condition was not conquest or survival, but outlasting. The winner was not the one who conquered the most territory or killed the most enemies. The winner was the one who could maintain a rival power structure, ideologically, militarily, economically, longer than the opponent could sustain theirs. And the United States won that contest not because of any special genius or moral superiority, but because the American system, for all its flaws, could generate the abundance necessary to sustain indefinite spending on weapons and projection of power. The Soviet system, no matter how brutally efficient its command economy had been, could not. It ran out of money, and when the money ran out, the coercion that held it together lost its credibility. This is what you need to understand when you look at empires, whether ancient or modern, whether they lasted 4 centuries or 1,000 years. The default trajectory of power is entropy. Systems tend toward disorder and collapse. What is remarkable is not that empires fall, that is inevitable. What is remarkable is that they hold together for as long as they do. The Persian Empire held for 2 centuries. Rome held for nearly 1,000 years in the West, longer in the East. The British Empire, at its height, controlled a quarter of the world's surface, but each of them eventually reached a threshold where the cost of maintaining the apparatus of empire exceeded the revenue it could generate or the population it could coerce. And at that threshold, empire becomes a liability rather than an asset. The same military spending that once projected power becomes a drain on resources. The same bureaucratic apparatus that once enabled efficiency becomes a suffocating layer of overhead. The same ideology that once unified the population becomes a transparent fiction that fewer and fewer people believe. The Cold War lasted 44 years. That is not a short span. It was longer than the entire reign of Napoleon, longer than the entire existence of the Third Reich. But by the standards of empires, it was relatively brief. And it ended not with a final battle or a dramatic surrender, but with a whimper, a Soviet economy that could not sustain itself, a population that had stopped believing in the system, and a final moment when a minor official made a small mistake at a press conference, and millions of people seized the opening that created. The wall came down because one system had run out of money and the other could afford to wait. And that fundamental imbalance, that difference in capacity, had been baked into the contest from the very beginning. When you understand this pattern, when you see how empires rise and fall along predictable lines based on economic sustainability, coercive capacity, and ideological coherence, you can look at the world today and ask harder questions. You can see the patterns forming before they become catastrophes. You can understand that military strength without economic sustainability is a trap. You can see that ideology without genuine popular support is paper thin. You can recognize the early signs of what is coming, in whatever form it takes. And most importantly, you understand that no superpower is exempt from these rules. Not then, not now, not ever. The moment an empire decides it can spend indefinitely, the moment it loses track of the true cost of its own maintenance, the moment the population it governs stops believing in its legitimacy, that is when the ending begins. It may take years or decades to unfold, but the trajectory is already set. Here is the single most important thing to hold on to as we live in our own era. The Cold War teaches us that empires are not immortal, but neither are they fragile. They are simply subject to physics, to the economics of sustainability, and the psychology of belief. The Soviet Union looked permanent right up until it was gone. The British Empire seemed built to last forever, until it didn't. Every great power throughout history believed that it had found some exception to the rules that govern all other systems. They were all wrong. And we are not exempt. This is not an argument for despair. It is an argument for clarity. When you see how empires actually fall, you are better equipped to understand what is real and what is merely theater. You can distinguish between genuine strength and the performance of strength. You can see when a system is sustainable and when it is slowly hollowing itself out. And that clarity, that ability to see beneath the surface, is what allows you to make better decisions about what comes next. The empires that lasted longest were not necessarily the strongest militarily. They were the ones that learned to adjust their costs to match their income, that could sustain genuine popular belief in their legitimacy, that did not assume their power was permanent. The Cold War ended the way it did, not with a bang but with an economic whimper, because the Soviet Union had made the opposite choice. It had spent as if it were infinite. It had coerced rather than convinced. It had assumed that what it had built would last forever. And when the moment came when those assumptions broke down, There was nothing left to hold it together. This is the secret I promised you at the beginning. Empires do not fall because they are conquered from the outside. They fall because they exhaust themselves from within, and that exhaustion reveals itself first in the economic numbers, long before it manifests in the streets. By the time the walls come down, the ending has already been written in the budgets, the inflation rates, and the hearts of the people who no longer believe. So here is your challenge this week. Look at the institutions and systems that shape your own life, economic, political, cultural, and ask yourself what costs they are sustaining, what percentage of resources they are consuming, and whether the population they govern still genuinely believes in their legitimacy. Do not ask these questions cynically. Ask them with the clarity that comes from understanding how empires actually work. Because the moment you can see a system clearly, see its real costs, its actual capacity, its true level of popular support, you have the power to understand what is sustainable and what is simply being prolonged through borrowed time. That is what the Cold War teaches us. That is what every fallen empire teaches us, and that is what will determine what comes next. Thank you for watching this full journey through how empires rise and fall through the lens of the Cold War. If this framework has changed the way you see history and power, please subscribe to Cold War Clarity so you never miss another deep dive into the forces that shaped our world. Leave a comment below and share which empire's fall resonates most with you, or what pattern you see forming in the world around you today. Hit the notification bell, and I will see you on the next episode.